from Doha, everyone. I'm Kamal Santamaria, and this is the News Hour from Al Jazeera.
This is a worst-case scenario, which civil servants obviously have to prepare for.
UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson downplays his own government's report on the possible chaos of leaving the EU without a deal. Also in the news, a US House Judicial Committee approves a vote that could ramp up impeachment efforts against President Donald Trump. A push for peace. Sudan's new Prime Minister meets armed groups to try to end the violence in the country's south. And we look at some of the misconceptions about vaccines as a summit in Brussels highlights the benefits.
In sport, one of the all-time greats of women's tennis is coming out of retirement for the second time.
Let's come back one more time. See you in 2020.
Kim Clijsters is returning to the pro game at the age of 36.
So the British Parliament might be suspended, but that doesn't mean there's any let-up in the countdown to Brexit. Yes, there has been some relief for the Prime Minister in the form of Northern Ireland's highest court dismissing a challenge to Boris Johnson's Brexit strategy. The court threw out a claim which argued a no-deal Brexit would undermine the 1998 peace process. However, Boris Johnson still faces mounting pressure after a Scottish court declared his suspension of Parliament to be unlawful. Critics now accuse him of misleading the Queen on the matter.
Did you lie to the Queen when you advised her to prorogue to suspend Parliament?
Absolutely not. And indeed, as I say, the High Court in England plainly agrees with us, but the Supreme Court will have to decide. We need a Queen's speech. We need to get on and do all sorts of things.
Boris Johnson and his cabinet ministers are also downplaying the government's report on a no-deal Brexit scenario that's predicted food and medicine shortages. And after a meeting with the European Parliament presidents on Thursday, the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, said he was ready to discuss any legally workable proposals from the UK, I should say, but he hasn't got any yet. Okay, Jonah Hull, following developments from London for us on this one. Hi, Jonah. Explain to us then if this is is this a big win for Boris Johnson today? Given the Scottish court ruled how it did yesterday, now we have this court in Belfast in his favour.
I'm not sure it's a big win per se, but I think the government will be relieved about this decision by the judges in Northern Ireland. Look, they more or less followed the reasoning of the judges in the English High Court who'd been asked to rule on a similar idea, whether the prorogation of Parliament was lawful or not. And they declined to say that it was unlawful. That's not the same as saying that the government did nothing wrong. The basis upon which they decided was the separation of powers. They basically said that it is not competent for the courts to rule on what was basically a political decision. As against that, the Scottish judges, of course, decided quite the contrary, and they were very happy to rule that it was unlawful to prorogue Parliament, also unlawful to have given the Queen the advice that Boris Johnson did, asking her to prorogue Parliament, because it was not for the purpose that he said it was for, which was, as he has insisted, a perfectly standard parliamentary procedure to bring a close to one session of Parliament and to open a brand new one with a new set of government priorities. Instead, this was done with, quote, the improper purpose of trying to stymie Parliament or muzzle it, render it unable to scrutinise the Brexit plan. So on the sort of legal balance sheet, 2-1 in favour of the government, broadly speaking, but there's really only one arbiter. That comes next week. It's the Supreme Court. It will decide in the end, and its decision will be final. And of course, if that goes against Boris Johnson, they'll have no comeback, the government, from that. That could be very difficult for him indeed.
And the other development, Jonah, this report, this worst-case scenario, apparently, I mean, again, Boris Johnson trying to say, well, yes, of course, we have to plan for it. Can you give us an idea of how bad the scenario is potentially looking?
Well, I think the fallout from this Operation Yellowhammer released on Wednesday night has been somewhat tempered by the fact that it was all leaked. Most of it was leaked to a British newspaper in August. So the sort of bald facts stated there or assumptions stated there have been released to the media already. But of course, the context is different now than it was in August. This is a government very much on the back foot, a government in minority. An election is coming. This is all manner to the opposition, who've been able to again lay all sorts of charges at the government's door: dishonest, irresponsible, responsible. You need to recall Parliament immediately. And to be able to say, with an election coming, look, this is an illustration of where this government would like this country to end up if it doesn't get a deal. Rather than do everything in its power to avoid no deal, this is a government that says it's happy to plan for no deal. The government, for its part, is saying, look, we took into account these assumptions in August when they were presented to us. We've since spent oodles of cash, $10 billion on mitigation for these consequences. We're about to release a new report that will include all these new assumptions and show everybody that we're now absolutely prepared for no deal, even if we weren't 2 months ago. As you rightly said there, they're sort of playing the whole thing down.
Jonah Hull in London. Thank you for all of that. Moving to other news, and lawmakers in the US have voted to move forward with investigative procedures that could lead to the impeachment of President Donald Trump. Now, the committee voted along party lines. It was approved over unanimous Republican opposition, and it will allow the enhanced questioning of witnesses. This is the first step in a very lengthy process that could eventually lead to an impeachment trial.
This committee is engaged in an investigation that will allow us to determine whether to recommend articles of impeachment with respect to President Trump. That is what we are doing. Some call this process an impeachment inquiry. Some call it an impeachment investigation. There's no legal difference between these terms, and I no longer care to argue about the nomenclature.
Here's Mike Hanna in Washington to explain a little more, and I do need a bit more context, I guess, from you on this one, Mike, because Democrat leader Nancy Pelosi has been very clear that she didn't want to go down the impeachment path, but here we see the first very sort of tentative baby steps towards that.
Well, what this is a consequence of the division among Democrats about whether or not to label this ongoing investigation into the Trump administration and the campaign that led to his election as an impeachment process. A number of Democrats are saying no, that would be politically damaging. So the committee now attempting to reconcile these divisions in effect. Now ruling that, yes, there are certain investigative procedures that can be followed. As you mentioned, this voted along party lines 24-17. So let me just mention what these procedures are. The committee is able to appoint secret hearings. It's able to appoint subcommittees that can deal with various aspects. It allows staffers to conduct questioning for an hour after members of the committee have finished questioning witnesses. Now, here is the point that Republicans are making on the committee. The chairman of the committee, the Democrat chairman, had all these powers before. Why then, the Republicans are arguing, was it necessary to hold this hearing, labeling it an impeachment process, the Republicans insisting that this is pure political grandstanding, an attempt to keep the term impeachment in the public discourse?
What would be the next step, Mike, if it does go further?
Well, the next step would be ongoing investigations by the Judiciary Committee, either as a whole or in its subcommittees. Now, that would eventually, or could eventually, lead to the decision that, yes, there is sufficient evidence to draw up articles of impeachment. The committee would then send that recommendation to the House. The House would then vote, and it needs a 2/3 vote, whether or not to proceed with those articles of impeachment. In the unlikely case that it did, that would go to the Senate, which would then effectively conduct a trial that would be decided by 2/3 once again. Now, at this particular stage, and many Democrats are arguing this, the sheer number in both House and Senate means that this process would not go forward. There would only be political fallout, and investigations into President Trump would be sharply undermined. So this is an ongoing debate. But what will happen in the immediate future is ongoing investigations, not only by the Judiciary Committee, but by a number of other House bodies that are continuing investigating actions by President Trump that they hope may give them enough evidence at some stage to begin discussions about drawing up articles of impeachment. It's a long and laborious process, Kamal.
Just thinking that very long road ahead. Thank you, Mike Hanna in Washington, D.C. Here is what's coming up for you on this NewsHour. The lesser-known victims of the war in Yemen. We will meet the fishermen battling for survival.
People are crying, and we are crying.
Zimbabwe says farewell to the founding leader who polarized the country in life and, it seems, in death. And in sport, the former heavyweight boxing champion preparing for the next step in his bid to retain the title. Now, hundreds of protesters have hit the streets across Sudan demanding reform. Demonstrators say Sudan's legal system is still dominated by members of former President Omar al-Bashir's regime months after he was removed from office. They want the country's new ruling coalition to remove the judges loyal to Bashir's allies, and they're calling for all former members to face justice. And Sudan's new Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok is making his first state visit to South Sudan in his new role. Juba is hosting talks between the transitional government and several armed groups. Hamdok has made peacemaking with groups fighting Khartoum one of his main priorities. You go right back to 2003, thousands of people have been killed in civil wars between Sudan's government and armed groups. This includes the conflict in Darfur, where fighting between armed groups of farmers and government forces displaced around 2.5 million people. Fighting in the region has subsided over the past 4 years, but the armed groups are still there. They're still active, and skirmishes continue to pop up. Reaching peace is a priority for this new transitional government, largely because it's a key condition for getting Sudan removed from the US sponsors of terrorism list. Here's Hebe Morgan in Juba with more.
It's the Sudanese Prime Minister's first foreign visit since he was appointed last month and is scheduled to last for 2 days. Now, the Prime Minister will be meeting with the head of state of South Sudan, Salva Kiir Mayardit, who is also at the moment the mediator of the peace talks between the Sudanese government and the armed group coalition known as the Sudanese Revolutionary Front and the Sudan's People Liberation Movement North. The Prime Minister is also scheduled to meet with the heads of these armed groups because he says that when he was appointed, he made a pledge that his transitional government will prioritize peace over anything else and will try to achieve it within the first 6 months of the 39-month transitional period. The Prime Minister has also said that Sudan will be an open space and will build its foreign relations based on common interests. And the interests between South Sudan and Sudan, two countries that were once one, go very deep. The two share a mutual economic interest, with South Sudan taking with it 75% of Sudan's oil facilities when it seceded in 2011. And the economy of the two countries is based on that pumping of oil and the export of those oil, with South Sudan paying Sudan oil fees, which supports the economies of the two countries. So it looks like, along with trying to make peace with the armed groups, the South Sudanese president and the Sudanese prime minister who's visiting will be talking about bilateral relations for the interest of the two countries.
Awal Allo is with us now, senior lecturer at Kiel University, a regular contributor with us on Al Jazeera. And, good to talk to you again. You know, I read two stories there. One was about the protests in Sudan, about the judicial system, about the remnants of the Bashir regime. And the second one is about this, huge objective of finding peace in Sudan as well. Seems to me there's a lot on the plate of this new ruling council.
Absolutely, and this is a challenge that every single transitional society has to confront at one point or another. In Sudan, as a country that has been under authoritarian system for such a long period of time, where various institutions, including institutions of justice, are filled by loyalists to the establishment, would have to confront that problem. So it is an issue that is, I think, going to challenge the current government, because it is simply not possible to purge all the institutions from those who are, who have been there and have some understanding of how the system works, have some institutional memory. You cannot replace all those individuals overnight. There are challenges there, but at the same time, I think it's only right that people are demanding that those institutions are properly cleaned up and filled by individuals that are independent and can actually deliver for the kind of change that people have been demanding. So those are clearly challenges that will continue, I think, to be in the front line, whether it is this government or any other government.
We're just looking at pictures there of the Prime Minister in Juba, as I said, trying to deal with the wider issue of peace in Sudan. I mean, how does a transitional government and an interim government go about dealing with something like that when the grievances go back to the early 2000s?
I think these are highly complex but also very much related problems. The problems that we have in the Blue Nile region, in South Kordofan, in Darfur, are problems that are very much intertwined with the problem of authoritarianism that has been there in Sudan for a very long time. But the Prime Minister, when he was sworn in, pledged that ensuring peace and stability is his primary policy goal, and I think that is absolutely crucial that the transitional government does that if they were to have any chance of establishing a peaceful democratic country. And I think his visit to South Sudan today is a very important signal or an indication that he is actually committed to that process. But I think most importantly, even beyond the question of peace and stability, South Sudan is a very important partner for Sudan, both economically and politically. Just yesterday, the opposition forces and the transitional government signed a peace deal in Juba with the help of South Sudan's president. South Sudan also needs Sudan for its own internal problems. Economically, the two countries are very much connected to one another because Sudan receives a huge sum of money from South Sudan for the oil infrastructure that South Sudan uses. So the two countries are very much connected in so many ways, and there is a lot, I think, that would be discussed over the course of these 2 days.
Interesting stuff. Awal Alo joining us from Kiel University. Always a pleasure. Thank you. Scientists, doctors and political leaders have all met in Brussels at a global vaccination summit. This is taking place as countries around the world face outbreaks of preventable diseases due to a lack of adequate vaccination. Laura Burden-Manley reports.
Measles, mumps, rubella and many other illnesses can all be prevented by a quick jab in the arm. Health officials say it saves the lives of up to 3 million people per year. But they also say the work is being threatened by a growing anti-vaccination campaign. Now scientists and doctors have met in Brussels to fight back.
It is unacceptable in the 21st century. Our children are dying from diseases that should not exist. We have to put an end to this intolerable situation. It's incumbent on each and every one of us.
Smallpox is no more thanks to vaccines. Polio has been pushed to the brink of eradication thanks to vaccines. Once feared diseases like diphtheria, tetanus, measles and meningitis are now easily prevented thanks to vaccines.
The World Health Organization is pointing to what it calls the myths about vaccines. They include diseases disappearing before vaccines were introduced. Medical professionals say vaccines have had a significant impact. And to the criticism of most people who get diseases have been vaccinated, WHO says most are 85 to 95% effective.
But only recently have we seen a mass anti-vaccination movement, and it's probably to do with the social media that's become so important at the moment in the way that people get their news. And now we have something which is spreading very rapidly, which is out of control.
This anti-vaccination campaign group in Washington, D.C. says the freedom to decide to vaccinate is a human right.
When you take away a person's freedom and medical choice, mandating vaccines for education, that is coercion.
Back in Brussels, Fergal Brennan is seeking to continue the advocacy work his sister did before she died of cervical cancer.
The voice of one girl can change everything. Laura passed away in March of this year from cervical cancer, a cancer that is almost entirely preventable. She was 26 years old. She dedicated the last months of her life to raising awareness of the importance of the HPV vaccination. She did it because if she had the HPV vaccine, it's likely I would not be here today. She would be with us.
I was diagnosed with cervical cancer.
Fergal says his sister received support, but also abuse when she tried to convince women to take the HPV vaccination. And he says it's fear based on mistrust and misinformation that this summit seeks to end. Laura Burden-Manley, Al Jazeera.
Peter Salamer's with us now, Executive Director from the World Health Organization. He's at that vaccine summit in Brussels. Thank you for your time, sir. I'm sure you're very busy. I want to... OK, let's take an example. Let's just say measles, for example. This year, United States, Ukraine, New Zealand, there have been outbreaks there. How frustrating is it, I guess, for people like yourself and people at the summit that a simple preventable disease like that is having outbreaks in the developed world now?
Well, it's nothing short of tragic that we have deaths from measles occurring in the 21st century. In fact, for the last year we have data, there were more than 100,000 deaths due to measles alone around the world. And as you said, even though the majority of these deaths are in poorer countries, we're now seeing outbreaks in European countries, in the US, in many places in the world, including New Zealand most recently. So it is tragic because it's so preventable.
So what do you do? Because, I mean, if we just take the example of the woman who was in our report just then, she's talking more about the issue of choice. And it seems like that sort of argument, that's you're possibly not going to make a difference with people who feel that way when it's just about choice.
Yeah. Well, there's two major reasons why we still around the world have around 20 million under-immunised children a year. And one has actually very little to do with vaccine misinformation. It's to do with the fact that poor children around the world, especially if they're displaced or in urban poor or in remote rural areas, there's around 20 million kids that just simply don't have access and availability of vaccines. And they happen to live predominantly in countries affected by conflict. So they're the Central African republics, the Somalias, the South Sudans, the Nigers, the Iraqs, the Yemens, the Syrias, the Haitis. They're countries. And that's the really major reason why children are under-immunised today. But there is this worrying trend, particularly in Western countries, more so than in poor countries, and we think that's probably because people haven't seen the devastating impact of vaccine-preventable diseases directly in the richer countries where there is this misinformation. What do you do about it? Well, you start with not giving people false information. And that's really what we're calling for by working with Facebook and Pinterest and Instagram to say, take the false information off. Where there's not scientific facts, take that away. And then, yeah, give people a real choice, but a well-informed choice by showing them really what the evidence and the data is. And you're right, ultimately, it's up to parents, but that should be an informed choice.
How's it going with the social media companies? I mean, I'm interested in that because we heard, again, people on a report saying that this was a big part in the spread of what they say is misinformation. How is it actually going with trying to remove that misinformation?
Yeah. In fact, we've seen a tremendous movement from the social media companies. So we've just announced partnerships in the last week with Pinterest, Facebook, Instagram, where they're really looking at their algorithms so that when people search up vaccines, that they are automatically taken first and foremost to evidence-based sites where there's scientific information, the WHO website, Center for Disease Control in the US, for example. But beyond that, they're also looking in a really nuanced way at how some of these groups have used information and data tracking systems to try and target misinformation to the right demographic groups. So they really want to avoid people getting slanted information, biased information, so they can make a true, well-informed choice. So we'll be working with them in an ongoing manner to make sure that people get access to a full range of views, and importantly that they can distinguish what's really evidence and science and fact from opinion. And in a complex world on the internet, we see that not just in relationship to vaccines, but to other issues, that's increasingly hard for people to distinguish. What's a fact? What's science? What's just someone's opinion?
Peter Salama from the World Health Organization in Brussels. Good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
The body of the former Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe will lie in state at a stadium in Harare. That is where he took oath as the leader nearly 4 decades ago. Mugabe is to be buried on Sunday, but there are ongoing discussions between his government and his family about exactly where he will be laid to rest. Haru Mutasa has more now from Harare.
Mugabe's body is now lying in state at Rufaro Stadium, and because there's been so much confusion over where he's going to be buried, the program just keeps on changing. The latest update so far is that Thursday and Friday he'll lie in state here at Rufaro Stadium. Saturday there'll be a memorial service at the National Sports Stadium in the capital, where several heads of state are expected to attend, mainly from Africa. Sunday his body goes to his rural village in Zimba, where he'll lie in state. People there in the village will go past and see his body, say goodbye one last time. But the family said right now they're not sure when or where he's going to be buried. President Emerson Mnangagwa met Grace Mugabe's wife earlier on Thursday to try and plan the burial. Family members have also been meeting all day. The government issued a statement to Zimbabwe telling them not to believe everything they hear on social media. They insist they are talking to the Mugabe family, trying to find out where and when Mugabe will be buried. But emotions are mixed in Zimbabwe about Mugabe's death. Here inside the stadium, it's a jovial mood. The people you see walking there, they've just been past his coffin. They got to see him one last time. They got to say goodbye. They say this is about celebrating his life. But just go outside the stadium. It's a poor neighborhood, lots of unemployment, dilapidated housing. Some people don't have electricity. Some people don't have access to running water. People are just frustrated. A common thing in Zimbabwe these days is just finding fuel. People wait for hours in long queues with their cars, hoping to get some fuel, which is very hard to find in the country right now. So some Zimbabweans, frustrated Zimbabweans, blame Mugabe for ruining what was once a prosperous economy. But the people in here say right now it's time to celebrate the life of a man they call the founding father of Zimbabwe.
At least 50 people have been killed when a train derailed in Democratic Republic of Congo's southeastern province of Tanganyika. A government minister says the accident happened around 3 a.m. local time in the town of Maibaridi. 4 Afghan soldiers have been killed in a suicide bombing near an army base in Kabul. The Afghan Minister of Defense confirmed the attack, 3 other soldiers injured, and it is the Taliban which has claimed responsibility. Tony Bertley with more from Kabul.
The attack happened on Thursday afternoon at a Afghan Army Special Forces base at Rish Kahor, 25 kilometers west of Kabul. A suicide bomber drove a van packed with explosives to the main gates and detonated them, initially killing 4 soldiers and wounding 3 others. The Taliban claim responsibility. It's the first major attack that the Taliban has carried out near the capital since President Trump cancelled the peace talks with the Taliban on a tweet. The Taliban at that time had threatened that the Americans would suffer more, and it was feared that there was going to be some kind of violent backlash from the Taliban because of those talks being cancelled. We've only had one other rocket fired from long range into the capital that landed somewhere near the American embassy, but there were no casualties and no serious damage. But there was apprehension here and concern. The fact that there hasn't been any major attacks within the city is being taken as a good sign, and perhaps a sign that the Taliban leadership is still confused about what to do, whether they want to carry on an escalation of this conflict or they want to get back to the negotiating table. The fighting is still carrying on all around the country. The Americans are putting incredible pressure on the Taliban, we are told. The aerial campaign in one period a week ago, they say, killed 1,000 Taliban fighters, and the Afghan army is claiming successes in various places and saying that some Taliban fighters are giving themselves up. So there is still a big war going on away from the peace negotiating table.
Still ahead for you on this NewsHour. Are we alone in the universe? Scientists have made a discovery that may be able to solve one of the biggest mysteries. And in sport, we will hear about the unlikely journey that's taken this golfer to the top of the women's game.
Hello again and welcome back. Well, here across much of the Levant, things are looking quite dry for the area, but we're going to be seeing some clouds mostly to the north, pushing across parts of the Caspian. For Baku, though, things are going to be improving for you. We do expect to see more sun in your forecast. A temperature there of 26, coming down to about 25 as we go towards Saturday. Down towards the south, though, winds are decreasing, so for Kuwait City, do expect to see a temperature of about 41 degrees. We're here across Yemen. I want to take you down here across the coast to Aden. I want to show you what they experienced just over the last couple of days with a sandstorm thunderstorm that moved through the area. Now, once it did, of course, it did bring the visibility down in the city quite considerably, slowing down the traffic. But by the time we got towards the evening, things began to improve as the skies did clear out across much of the area there. You can see the sand pushing through. Of course, the airport did see delays as well as cancellations. Here on Friday, Sana, we do expect to see a cloudy day for you there. But as we go towards Saturday, things do improve. Temperature coming down to about 24 degrees. As we make our way down here across the southern part of Africa, while temperatures are on the rise for some locations, over here towards Durban, though, we do expect to see a temperature for you of about 23 degrees. Up towards Johannesburg, it is going to be 27, but clouds are in the forecast for Cape Town with a temperature of 15.
You're on the NewsHour here at Al Jazeera, and these are our top stories. Belfast's High Court has thrown out a case claiming the Brexit strategy of Boris Johnson's government jeopardises the 1998 Northern Ireland Peace Accord. A US House committee voted to adopt a resolution intended to intensify its impeachment investigation into President Donald Trump. The measure allows the panel to define the rules of an impeachment probe, including calling witnesses. The committee did vote along party lines. And the body of former Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe is lying in state at a stadium in Harare, the same place he took oath as a leader nearly 4 decades ago. His final resting place, though, is still unknown, as his family and Zimbabwe's government are at odds over where he should be buried. More now on our top story, those court rulings on Brexit, and Prime Minister Boris Johnson, as we said, did win a reprieve from Northern Ireland's top court. But the legal fight is far from over, as Jonah Hull reports from London.
MPs have been forced into recess, but for Boris Johnson the battle has shifted to the courts. Judges in Northern Ireland have joined those in England in declining to rule the prorogation of Parliament illegal. But Scottish judges on Wednesday said Johnson's advice to the Queen to suspend Parliament had been unlawful and motivated by a desire to muzzle Parliament.
Did you lie to the Queen when you advised her to prorogue, to suspend Parliament?
Absolutely not. And indeed, as I say, the High Court in England plainly agrees with us, but the Supreme Court will have to decide.
Opposition MPs, meanwhile, are clamouring to return to work after succeeding in forcing the government to release its internal Operation Yellowhammer report. It contains worst-case scenario predictions for a no-deal Brexit, clogged up ports, fresh food and medicine shortages, price rises and civil unrest. But of course, no House of Commons to scrutinise its findings.
That's why we're so angry that Parliament was prorogued, because I should be in Parliament at the moment with the ability to interrogate the Prime Minister and ministers. Now we're prorogued, we can't do that.
And the Prime Minister again.
This is a worst-case scenario, which civil servants obviously have to prepare for. But in the last few months, and particularly in the 50 days since I've been Prime Minister, we've been massively accelerating our preparations.
Boris Johnson says a no-deal Brexit is not his desired outcome. He says he's doing everything he can to reach a new deal with the European Union at an October leaders' summit just a few days after Parliament is due to return. No mention of the new law requiring Johnson to seek a Brexit extension if no new deal emerges, nor any detail on what a new deal may look like. And again, no Parliament to ask any questions. It's all pretty bewildering when viewed from Brussels.
I think that his whole plan is to take the UK out of the European Union without any deal, but at the same time being in a position to blame the European Union for inflexibility.
All eyes on the Supreme Court next week then, with the government in the meantime giving its very best impression of being entirely unmoved. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, London.
Now, Mexico says it disagrees with a recent US Supreme Court decision that's ruled in favor of Donald Trump's latest effort to restrict immigration. The court allowed a ban on nearly all asylum applications at the Mexico border to go into effect. People will now have to seek asylum in the first safe country they travel through, which effectively blocks most applications. Here is Manuel Rapallo joining us now from Mexico City with more on this. Manuel, what's the official response been on this one?
Mexican authorities have maintained the same line that they have since this policy was first suggested or unveiled back in June. But we did hear on the news from the Supreme Court ruling from Mexican Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard, who said, quote, this is a U.S. issue and obviously we don't agree with it. We have a different policy. We also heard from Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who said that he had an excellent conversation with President Trump over the phone. But what must be irking leadership within the Mexican government is constantly, since the beginning of the year, having to adapt to pressures from the United States to do more to curb back migration, as well as changes in U.S. national policy that have direct impacts here in Mexico.
So how will this change then, Manuel, in asylum policy actually affect Mexicans and Mexico as a country?
Absolutely. Mexico has already been faced with pressures from the United States. They're constantly having to adapt to changes in policy, or else in some cases, at least one case, having to face the threat of tariffs by the United States on exports leaving Mexico bound for the United States. And Mexico has been successful in this regard, showing a reduction in migration numbers of upwards of 50% migration heading toward the United States. But the biggest impact of this policy change will be felt by the migrants themselves, a majority of whom are coming in from Central America, countries like Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, but also other countries in South America and Africa, as well as Asia, and the potential for thousands of asylum applicants who will be ineligible to apply for asylum in the United States. And the big concern here in Mexico is whether or not the country has the resources to handle this potential surge in asylum applicants in Mexico.
Thank you, Manuel Rapallo, in Mexico City. Google has agreed to pay another $500 million in taxes to France, a payment which ends a 4-year investigation into the US tech giant. Here's Natasha Butler in Paris to talk more about this. Natasha, define agreed to pay, because generally Google wouldn't part with $500 million just like that.
Yes, but it does seem that the company has agreed to do this. And the background to this story is that 4 years ago, French investigators started looking into whether or not Google was in fact avoiding paying enough tax in France. The investigation really focused on whether Google was properly declaring its activities in France to the French state. Now, Google actually has its European headquarters in Dublin, in Ireland. It is a low-tax economy. And what the company does is it tends to declare most of its sales and activities in Ireland. In that way, it manages to avoid paying as much tax as it could do in other European countries. And this is something that it's basically benefited from an international tax loophole, where a French financial prosecutor has found that to be unfair. It has put this very large fine on Google, taking the total settlement that Google will pay to the French state up to $1 billion. And it all is part of a campaign by Emmanuel Macron. Even though this particular case predates Emmanuel Macron's presidency, the French president's been very adamant that these social media giants, these digital companies that have activities around the world are using these sort of tax loopholes to avoid tax. And he wants a new international tax law to take that into account, to stop this kind of tax evasion, if you want to put it in that way. And in fact, French President Emmanuel Macron has also slapped a digital tax on these major companies, Google, Amazon, Facebook. He put that on those companies back in July because he says that those companies need to pay more tax in the countries in which they have operations, but the current tax laws don't take into account this new globalized world that we all live in.
Okay, thank you for that update, Natasha Butler in Paris. Flooding's left at least 57 people dead in Niger. Months of heavy rain has destroyed homes and businesses in the West African state. Tens of thousands of people have been displaced, and the country is still recovering from damage caused by floods last year. Katia Lopez-Odoyan has more.
Entire streets in Niger's capital, Niamey, are submerged. Heavy rain and floods proved too much for retaining walls along the Niger River. Across the country, more than 12,000 homes have been destroyed. Those who refuse to leave save what they can. Sandbags are filled to stop more water from flooding homes. A neighborhood watch keeps track of the river levels 24 hours a day.
Authorities had urged people who lived along the river to prepare for the floods, but many of us didn't know where we could go.
More than 130,000 people have been affected by the floods since June. Many displaced families are now living in schools, but it's unclear how long they'll be allowed to stay. They worry they won't have a home to go back to.
Some homes were flooded but haven't crumbled yet. In one day, about 250 houses were totally demolished. If the rain keeps coming, it will continue to destroy.
Crops have been destroyed and infrastructure damaged, but the government says it can only offer limited support. Volunteers are putting up tents for the displaced. It's not meant as a long-term solution, but for those who've lost everything, it's a lifeline.
We're here to help build the tents and shelters for the victims of the flood. These are people who had to flee the banks of the Niger River, so we just want to help our community.
The country was already facing a crisis. Extreme weather has caused a food shortage in recent years. Violence linked to Boko Haram has forced many from their homes. More than 2 million people are in need of humanitarian aid. The government says the worst of the rain is over, but the threat to its population remains, both from flooding and the ever-present risk of a cholera outbreak. Katia Lopez-Odoyan, Al Jazeera.
During more than 4 years of war in Yemen, fishermen have risked their lives to set their nets and to bring home their catch. Many, though, have not survived, becoming victims of attacks by the Saudi-UAE coalition, which is fighting the Houthi rebels. Their story now from Mohammed Al-Attab at the port of Hodeidah.
Omar is at the port of Hodeidah in Yemen every day to watch the fishermen return from the sea. He used to be one of them until he lost his hand in an attack by government forces.
As we were preparing to go to sea, we were suddenly attacked. I ran to help an injured colleague, but there was a second attack and I was flung to the ground. I lost my hand and that's deprived me of an income.
The 23-year-old was the sole breadwinner in the family after his father was paralyzed in a motorcycle incident.
I used to be a fisherman, but after my accident, we depend on Omar. Now, we're both crippled.
We went to sea ourselves to check out the risks fishermen take. There is no official agreement with the Saudi-UAE coalition and government forces fighting Houthis as to how far out Yemenis can take their boats into the Red Sea.
We have entered now the 4th mile from the coastline of Al-Hodeidah. We can see here one of the fishermen who was using the traditional fishing. He couldn't go further, fearing for his life.
The Seaports Authority in Hodeidah, which is run by the Houthis, says fishermen have been targeted before.
Fishermen could not go to areas 20 to 30 miles off the coastline where fish are available in big quantities for fear of being attacked by Saudi warships and Apache helicopters.
Human Rights Watch says 46 fishermen have been killed since the start of the war more than 4 years ago. But the Ports Authority puts that figure much higher at 267. And it's reported one of the victims was a child 14 years old.
Human Rights Watch said a child was on a fishing boat and waved at a helicopter and showed off the box of fish that they had caught, but he was the first one killed. Now we asked them, what is your next move? Will you raise such injustices at the International Court of Justice?
With food in short supply in Yemen, the sea at least provides a source of meals and work for Hodeidah's fishermen. Market is busy, but has itself been attacked during the war. Every day, a challenge for Yemenis at sea and on land. Mohammed Al-Attab, Al Jazeera, Al-Hodeidah.
In northwest Syria, airstrikes and fighting are preventing thousands of children from starting school. Hundreds of education facilities have been damaged or affected by the ongoing violence. Sinem Kosioglu explains now how some children are coping in a refugee camp in Idlib province.
No schools and no playgrounds. And for Fatima and other children like her, no break from hardship and deprivation. Here in Idlib, in this refugee camp for Syrians displaced by the war, there is no start to the school year. But that's not stopping Fatima and her sisters from helping each other to get some of the education they have missed out on.
When I first started school, we had to leave because of the airstrikes and shelling. I studied till 4th grade, then the regime attacked our village again and we moved, and then I couldn't go to school. I wish I had and could become a doctor or a nurse. We need them to treat people here.
For many young Syrians, the war is their main memory of childhood, and it is one without schooling.
I was too young. I can't remember anything. I want to become a teacher so boys and girls can learn. I want to build hospitals and houses for the poor and the displaced.
When the war started, Fawaz was 4 years old. Now he is 12 and is unable to read or write and says there is little chance to remedy that here.
How can we learn something? Even to wash our hands we need to go out. It's all mud and dust. When we return home we're dirty. We wish we went out like other children and stayed clean, but we play under the trees. We're surrounded by 4 walls.
Over the past 4 months, fighting and airstrikes have displaced around 500,000 Syrians across Idlib. Many come here, and there are more than 200 schools in northwest Syria for the children being used as shelters. And standards of living have dropped so low that everyday survival is increasingly people's top priority. Sinem Kösoğlu, Al Jazeera.
Cuba's president says his country will soon be acutely short of fuel unless emergency measures are taken. Miguel Diaz-Canel says Cuba is feeling the effects of the United States' block on its oil shipments. Cuba's imposed austerity measures since 2015, when oil supply from its ally Venezuela started declining. Back in the 1990s, Cuba even went as far as blackouts and food shortages because oil supplies were disrupted.
The problem is short-term and not the result of bad management or capacity of the Cuban government, as the United States has tried to say. We have many problems to solve, but this in particular is not the result of our insufficiencies. Rather, it has to do with the aggressive measures that the United States government is extraterritorially imposing to economically suffocate our people.
Well, the search for alien life just got a little more interesting. Scientists from University College London have detected water vapour in the atmosphere of another world more than twice the size of our Earth. It is the first time a planet orbiting a star outside our system, or exoplanet as they call it, has been found with both water and temperatures that could support life. This report from Catherine Stansel.
110 light years away from our planet, there is a super Earth, a world where life could exist outside of our solar system. K2-18b was discovered in 2015. Astronomers used data gathered from the Hubble telescope to analyze light filtered through the planet's atmosphere. They found water vapor and helium. The exoplanet also orbits its sun's habitable zone, meaning that temperatures are stable and favorable to host life forms.
This planet is potentially habitable, so we're talking about a planet that, on paper, based on calculations, is able to host liquid water. Right now we can only calculate temperatures for these planets. K2-18b is the only one that we go one step further. We know that there is water in the atmosphere, but to go to habitable planets, that would require many advances and many more observations.
Researchers at University College London believe that other molecules found on Earth, like nitrogen and methane, are also present in the atmosphere. The exoplanet may have the conditions to support life, but it's not another version of the Earth. It's twice as big, has a smaller sun, and is far more dense. And scientists currently don't have the technology to physically reach the planet or analyze its surface to determine if life actually exists there. K2-18b is one of thousands of exoplanets, but being trillions of kilometers away, it's unlikely humans will ever be able to reach them.
Even though this is a very exciting discovery, we should wind back a little bit because it's just an indication that something that we know is vital for life as we understand it, water, is present on this world. But whether that indicates that there is life there is another question entirely. The more we learn about the cosmos, the more we realise that perhaps the Earth has this singular combination of characteristics Now, numerically, there should be other worlds out there like Earth, but at the moment we haven't discovered them.
New, more powerful telescopes are expected to be launched over the next few years. They'll be able to provide deeper and more accurate analysis of K2-18b and other exoplanets, allowing astronomers to discover their composition and learn more about the evolution of worlds outside of our solar system. Catherine Stansel, Al Jazeera, London.
Still ahead for you on Al Jazeera, the sport, as Japan gears up for rugby's biggest international tournament, which New Zealand is going to win. Of course, Andy is here with your sport in a moment. Andy and I were just discussing big tennis comebacks.
Yeah.
And you're going to throw another one in there.
Well, King Clijsters has come back before and she was very successful then. And as one of the all-time greats of women's tennis, she's coming out of retirement now for the second time. King Clijsters announcing a shock comeback at the age of 36.
Could I be a loving mom to my 3 kids and the best tennis player I can possibly be? Let's do this. Let's come back one more time. See you in 2020.
Well, the Belgian, who won 41 singles titles, plans to return to action in January, says she's been considering a comeback for 2 years now. This is the second time that she's come out of retirement. During her career, Clijsters has been ranked world number 1 in both singles and doubles, winning a total of 4 Grand Slam singles titles. Now, with just 1 Grand Slam title to her name, the 2005 US Open, Clijsters first retired from tennis in 2007 at the age of 23 to start a family. She then returned in 2009 and went on to win 2 more US Opens as well as the Australian Open, her second retirement coming in 2012. Well, just days after a historic first overseas test win for Afghanistan, the country's domestic game has suffered a major blow. The second season of the Afghanistan Premier League has been pushed back to 2020. It was set to begin next month, but Afghanistan's cricket board has delayed the tournament due to a financial dispute with the league's main investor. Afghan authorities are also investigating allegations of corruption in the competition. Australia aiming to complete their first Test series win in England since 2001. The 5th and final Ashes Test is underway in London with Australia 2-1 up in the series, batting first at the Oval. England right now 186 for 5. Now, the coach of reigning Super Bowl champions, the New England Patriots, has refused to rule out the possibility of Antonio Brown playing in the team's next game. Bill Belichick says the team are taking sexual assault allegations against Brown very seriously. Well, one of the NFL's biggest stars, Brown trained for the first time with his team since the allegations surfaced. He was accused of rape on Tuesday and is facing a civil lawsuit. The player's attorney said his client denies each and every allegation.
We've looked into the situation. We're taking it very seriously, all the way through the organization. Sure, there are questions, but I'm not going to be entering into a discussion about that today.
Now, Megan Kang says she'll be channeling her parents' bravery when golf's Solheim Cup tees off on Friday in Scotland. For the first time in her career, Kang will be part of the US team taking on Europe. The 21-year-old's parents were forced to flee from Laos 4 decades ago in the fallout from the Vietnam War.
I'm very proud of both my parents. My mom took a risk of having my dad quit his job to focus on golf and coaching myself. And it was a risk that she was willing to take. And if she hadn't been so willing, I probably would not be here today. I probably wouldn't be playing golf. Because of this huge sacrifice that they both took, I'm able to do what I love. And my parents are here to travel with me around the world. And so I hope to kind of inspire kids who may have this background as my family did and say, hey, if they can do it, I can do it.
Well, Europe haven't won the trophy since 2013. The event follows a similar format to the men's Ryder Cup, with the players competing in pairs on Friday and Saturday, followed by 12 singles matches on Sunday.
I've always loved the Solheim Cup. You know, it's been the highlight of my career every 2 years when it comes around. Some of my best moments have been in the Solheim, and I think to be a winning captain here at Gleneagles in Scotland would rank probably just about above my British Open win.
Japanese Prime Minister has been getting a closer look at the Rugby World Cup trophy. Shinzo Abe also presented with a signed shirt here by Japan's team captain Michael Leach as the country gets ready to host the tournament for the first time. The home team face Russia in the opening match on September the 20th in Tokyo. And heavyweight boxer Tyson Fury says he's taking his upcoming fight seriously, even though he's pursuing a rematch against world champion Deontay Wilder. Fury will take on the undefeated Otto Wallin in Las Vegas on Saturday. It'll be his second fight since the split decision draw against Wilder in December. Both these fighters are undefeated heading into this contest.
The fact is, I don't underestimate anybody. I give everybody the ultimate respect. Even if I'm fighting a guy who's had 20 fights and lost 20, I will train for him like he's had 20 knockouts in a row, because I never fail to prepare. I trained hard for this fight, as hard as I trained for Wilder, as hard as I trained for anybody. I've not overlooked him. I've been in America for 5 weeks training. I was in Spain for 2 weeks before that, and I was at home for 2 weeks before that. I'm as strong as I've ever been. I feel very, very fit and very, very accurate.
For those of you who remember him wearing a Mexican wrestling mask yesterday, that is what he looks like. Full beard.
Behind the mask. Lovely.
The man behind the mask.
Nice of you to loan it to him, Andy. Thank you very much. Andy's back with more sport at 1800 hours GMT. I'll be back then as well, and I'll be back in about 2.5 minutes' time as well. Another full bulletin of news right here on Al Jazeera.